Hello, you're watching Initiative Africa. My name is Asha Samput. Welcome to this first 2024 edition of your weekly magazine featuring Africa on the move through smart innovations and initiatives that work. Today, we'll look at urban housing reforms in the context of climate change. But first, here are the main highlights. Our guest is among those who want to change African cities, a specialist in the strategic management of decentralized local authorities. He has developed coaching, lobbying, business engineering and economic intelligence activities. And after that, decided to take the plunge into public life by becoming mayor of Yaoundé 7 in 2013. He has since been appointed head of the Cameroon Association of United Towns and Cities. Augustin Tamba is our guest today.
Il y a beaucoup de problèmes qui se posent. There are a lot of problems. We need to talk about resilient housing and even resilient cities. But the problem is posed differently. I'd like to say that today, we need to think differently about the notion of the city.
Safe and sustainable urban housing is the new priority for African cities. Let's take a look at an expert conference in Yaoundé, Cameroon.
I'm very pleased to receive this roadmap, which sets everyone in their place. First and foremost, city councillors and local elected representatives. The mayors of districts, towns and cities must take their role seriously.
We head for Accra to discover a place that is still rare in Africa, a library dedicated to African authors, as well as writers from the diaspora to raise awareness about their contribution to world literature.
We are a library that focuses on books by writers of African descent. And when we say African descent, we mean African, African American, Caribbean, Black British, Black European.
While COP28 concluded last month with an agreement calling for a transition away from fossil fuels and a target of carbon neutrality by 2050, Africa continues to face the consequences of climate change. The continent's demographic expansion is bringing its own share of often dramatic incidents to African cities. Floods and landslides that sweep away homes have become more frequent. Experts believe that the issue of safe and sustainable housing for the continent's cities has become urgent. A recent international conference was held in Cameroon on this subject a few days after a tragedy in Yaoundé. This is a report from our correspondent Abubakar Munchili.
Bodies of children, women and men that people are desperately seeking. These images of devastation following heavy rains in Yaoundé, Cameroon, have circulated worldwide, sparking outrage. Makeshift houses, most of them built on the side of the hill, Mount Mambakolo, have just collapsed under the pressure of the water and the landslide. The results are appalling.
All the pool of water descended and then ravaged everything here, carried houses with people who were already sleeping in their houses.
Nearly 30 deaths, according to official figures. Specialists are blaming climate change, but not solely. There's also the role of anarchic constructions not adapted to the requirements of the terrain put in place not only by a precarious population, but also by a more privileged social stratum, all of them taking advantage of the lax property regulations governing space and building use, legal provisions that are not firmly being respected. Cameroon is not the only country in Africa or the world to experience this kind of disaster. Here, as elsewhere, demographic growth and the rapid development of cities have become real challenges.
Africa's urban population doubles every 20 years. It was only 27 million in 1950, and it has multiplied by 20 in 70 years. In some cities, the population has multiplied by 4 or 5 within a decade. So development is outpacing capabilities for planning and infrastructure investment.
And as a result, according to the experts, cities today are spreading out rather differently, horizontally, in what is called the informal city, being those areas apart.
These areas are at risk in terms of climate change because they are typically designed as non-aedificandi, meaning they should not be occupied. However, when people migrate to the city and find no available space, they settle there. This is where the challenges of climate change, climate shocks, or climate risk intersect with sustainable housing, becoming challenges that need to be addressed simultaneously.
Challenges that must be overcome to ensure that such disasters never happen again on the continent. It was against this dramatic backdrop that an international conference on climate change and sustainable housing was held in Yaoundé. The conference is part of UN Habitat's World Urban Campaign, in particular the International Climate Agenda.
This is a very important meeting and the issues at stake are enormous. These days, it is not just a thought. It is not just something philosophical. The climate is changing, as we have seen. If we do nothing, we are going to create disasters.
It's an issue that's very close to our heart and one that generates a lot of questions and a lot of government action.
More than 600 high-ranking personalities, experts, players in the field, representatives of local government, business and civil society took part in the conference. It was a rich gathering with a range of discussions formats for sharing content and debating, including roundtables, workshops and above all forums for highlighting best practices and presenting projects from civil society.
We have around 40 projects from civil society. There were those who presented the style of housing needed to bring about change. There were projects that also supported young people in the various initiatives so that they, especially the grandchildren and pupils, could grow up with the spirit of ecological transition.
For the Global Association Climate Chance, which organized the conference, it was a successful opportunity to sound the alarm once again, and above all, to involve the various players concerned in the important work of building African cities and the housing of the future in the face of climate challenges.
I think it was a conference that focused on informal settlement, which is often a taboo subject in Africa. Informal housing is often what we don't want to see, referring to develop new building programs with more Western standards, but which are very expensive. So they don't meet the needs in terms of quantity, because this informal housing is not going to disappear overnight. So we also need to integrate it into the strategy for sustainable housing in Africa.
The question of funding is obviously inevitable, but the participants also looked at other aspects. They discussed at length the issues of strengthening the capacity for action of local governments and local authorities, mastering urban planning, land governance, and above all the quality of construction and the integration of traditional materials.
It's a real challenge. There are skills that need to be preserved and passed on in Africa. We need new training courses, channels and certifications. We emphasized on this point.
A set of proposals to meet the climate challenges and promote sustainable housing in Africa has been set out in a document known as the Yaoundé Roadmap, an advocacy document aimed at the various governments on the continent.
I'm very pleased to receive this roadmap, which sets everyone in their place. First and foremost, city councillors and local elected representatives. The mayors of districts, towns and cities must take their role seriously. When it comes to taking into account the rural sector, precarious neighborhoods, urban planning and funding, we will be doing our utmost as the minister responsible for sustainable housing to support them in the non-governmental advocacy they will be doing.
But while a further step was taken in Yaoundé, we still have to wait for all the players involved to really get down to work. There's one hope: the gradual arrival on the continent of cities and habitats that are safer from climate change and are more sustainable. In other words, as the specialists explain, cities that are better organized, where adapted housing, mobility and green spaces have become a prerequisite for everyone's well-being.
Let's now meet our guest, Augustin Tamba, the mayor of Yaoundé 7 and the president of the Cameroon Association of United Towns and Municipalities, who is at the heart of issues related to sustainable housing. Faced with the combined challenges of climate change and funding, what will the African cities of tomorrow look like? He spoke to Abubakar Munchili in Yaoundé.
Hello, Augustin, Tamba. Thank you for joining us on Initiative Africa. You recently took part in the International Conference on Climate Change and Sustainable Housing in Yaoundé. What were at stake?
There are a lot of problems. We need to talk about resilient housing and even resilient cities. But the problem is posed differently. I would like to say that today, we need to think differently about the notion of the city. Perhaps we need to think about promoting intermediate towns and territories, rural communes, if you like. Why should we do this? Because in Africa, there is enormous potential for developing agriculture in all its conceptual cross-cutting aspects. That is livestock farming, fish farming, modern agriculture, etc. Because this is a source of added value. We are therefore thinking of a policy of economic co-production, concentrated in the territories with the economic potential, because there is significant potential in our territories. There's the land, which is good for everything, agriculture, farming, etc. There's the wood, there's the soil, there's the environment for tourism, development. And so we want to professionalize all that, and to do that, we have to look for people. We need to find professionals elsewhere. We need to find funding. That's why I'm talking about economic co-production, but based on regional development.
At this conference, there was a lot of talk about funding to meet the challenges of building safe and sustainable cities. Do you think that the co-production funding model is best suited to these issues?
Everything we are going to build is based on the ability to act financially. And I don't believe in global philanthropy. I believe in a global contribution to the fight against climate change, even though commitments are not being met. Out of 100 billion released internationally at the conference in Copenhagen, I think it was only 2 billion that went to Africa. I think that's a drop in the ocean of needs. So there needs to be a little international justice. We've talked about a number of things. A local tax that will go into the fund set up by the states, which would be financed by companies involved in oil extraction, mineral extraction, timber extraction, food processing, breweries, brewing industries in general, etc., and which are also polluting in the process. The funds raised would allow local authorities to build decent housing and to talk about resilient cities. You know, initially housing is not social. The cost of housing is not social. There is a cost to building housing. But it's a political decision to say that this housing will be social. So part of the funding has to go somewhere. Hence, this engineering, which can only be based on the co-production that I mentioned at the outset. In other words, these multi-actors which enable the state, development partners, and local authorities to work together to improve and build decent housing.
What is the practical reality on the ground of the state's support for the communes and united towns of Cameroon?
In our vision of CUV, United Towns and Cities of Cameroon, we are committed to regional diplomacy, which means that following a marketing program that aims to turn towns into levers for growth and development hubs, we can produce there, and this will also create jobs in urban areas. Young people would leave the cities to find these centers of interest and added value at local level. This would also enable us to structure these intermediate towns and rural towns in a way that reflects what we are developing for the future. In urban areas, the dismantling of deprived areas also poses a cost concern, which we see in the first field of intervention. There is a concept that has been developed internationally, namely the participation of indigenous populations in the release of land, concerted development that consists of ensuring that rural landowners can give up plots of land in exchange for development of infrastructure, energy, and water. And in terms of development, these are concerted developments. In other words, they give up part of the land and retain ownership of the other part. But this land is gaining in value, so it can also be used for projects we are dreaming of today. And we also need to say that we need inclusion policies, local materials in rural housing, so that we don't fall into the trap we are seeing today. And even in the city, we need to explore ways of making housing cheaper, but with due regard for the environment and promotion of local materials.
Welcome to the second part of our show. A new generation of African writers is now being celebrated worldwide, an opportunity to revisit the continent's literary classics. In Accra, Anglo-Ghanaian Sylvia Arthur had the idea of developing her personal collection into a library of 4,000 books to pay tribute to Africa's contribution to world literature and encourage young authors. Our journalist John Owotwe visited this exceptional place. Take a look.
Ghana's burgeoning literary scene has received a significant boost with the introduction of the Library of Africa and the African Diaspora, Ghana's first subscription model library, founded by Ghanaian-British writer Sylvia Arthur. It's in the heart of Accra.
In Ghana, there is a lack of access to culturally relevant books. And when I say culturally relevant books, I mean books that are reflective of the people who are reading them. So we are a library that focuses on books by writers of African descent. And when we say African descent, we mean African, African American, Caribbean, Black British, Black European.
Sylvia Arthur is a book enthusiast with over 4,000 books in her personal collection. Her collection includes some very rare autographed books by Kwame Nkrumah.
So in this display cabinet here, we have books that are rare and out of print and signed, and they're very difficult to get hold of today. One of them is Kwame Nkrumah's signed autobiography, Ghana My Autobiography, signed by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana in 1963. Below that, we have a whole collection of signed first edition Aikwe Amar books. Aikwe Amar, famous Ghanaian writer, probably best known for his 1968 book, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. I call him Ghana's Chinua Achebe, but his books are very difficult to get hold of, let alone to get first editions and rares, and so we have a whole collection down there. And then above on the display cabinet here, we have Kamara Lai, The Dark Child. Kamara Lai, Guinean writer.
Sylvia opened the library in 2017, using 1,300 books from her personal collection and making many rare works accessible to Ghanaians for the first time. The library currently serves a broad spectrum of patrons, from professionals to schoolchildren and students, as well as musicians. Sylvia aims to use her library to support the country's literary scene, which, while currently struggling, has great potential. She occasionally holds seminars and workshops for writers and other literary creatives, transforming her space into a collaborative environment where Ghanaian writers and book lovers can share ideas.
One of the ways we try to get around people's kind of reluctance to read is that we host a number of events in this space. So it's not just a library that's, you know, a dead space for books. We have music performances, we have spoken word events, we have film screenings. We do a ton of events that bring people into the library so that they're not necessarily coming here for the books initially.
The library operates on a subscription basis. Members pay roughly $8 a month to borrow up to 2 books at a time. Children pay $3.50 and can take 4 books. Fauziatou Moro, a graduate student of the University of Ghana, is a patron of the Library of Africa and the African diaspora. Over the last 2 years, she has found the library a useful resource for her academic work and for her own ambitions as a fictional writer.
I see myself writing beyond the academic works that I would ordinarily write if I go into academia. I see myself writing creative nonfiction because then I'm almost around facts all the time, so it's very difficult to move beyond facts to fiction. And being here, I have been introduced to so many forms of creative nonfiction which have widened or broadened my scope about the genre and how, as a historian who deals with fact, can maneuver my way around it and produce creative nonfiction as well. So yes, I aspire to write, and I feel this is like the perfect setting for me.
Most of the people who come to this library, whether they're members of book clubs, whether they're just interested in books and want to be in the space, I would say are mainly women.
The library is a sure way to impact the reading culture of Ghanaians and spur an interest, particularly in Africa's own literary arts.
We now return to our guest, Augustin Tamba, who will share more specifically about the link between economic development and uncontrolled building in some African neighborhoods. Let's hear what he has to say.
The anarchic occupation of spaces with substandard buildings leads to disasters, as we saw recently in Yaoundé. What's happening? What is the problem?
But the problem is people's standard of living. It's an economic problem. If you don't have money, you can't invest. And for our economies to be able to develop, there are things to be done. And that's why we called earlier at the conference. We called for more, for climate justice, so that what is released at global level to promote and combat climate change in our cities, a large part of it is allocated to Africa, which is the world's second largest source of oxygen. There are also government policies and private policies which respond to a much more specific type of engineering, because there's a risk of coefficient. Private banks are in the business of making profits, so there's no single typology that can be put in place. There's no global solution. There are a variety of problems that arise, and we believe that in Africa, it is a problem of economic development that is at the root. Governments have a lot of will. A lot is being done in Cameroon today. We are part of the strategic thinking that wants our cities to be great places to live.
Let's talk about the National Association of United Towns and Municipalities of Cameroon, of which you are the president. What is its role and contribution to building Cameroon?
It is an association. It's our umbrella body that lobbies financial institutions, all institutions, development partners, and above all, the government. The government that implements state policies. So we provide this interface so that we can help the government to better address the problems facing the population, which are opposed to the cities and which can help to improve the living conditions of Cameroonians. And I believe that this advocacy is permanent. It is adjustable. We are not a union to fight the government. We are here to work alongside the government, but to pose the problems without complacency so that the right solutions can be found, because we are in action every day. And I can tell you that it's not easy being a mayor.
That's a mayor.
You are the mayor of one of the largest municipalities in Cameroon's capital. What are the challenges facing municipalities like yours today?
The biggest challenge is to improve people's living conditions, but this is a very broad view. There's infrastructure, there's water, there's energy, there's survival, health, education, so it's multidisciplinary. So I wouldn't wish you to be mayor, especially without the means.
And if that's the case, how are the country's mayors and local authorities meeting their commitments and tackling these challenges?
But the local authorities have the limited resources that have been put in place, and we are working hard to increase these resources and our capacity to intervene.
You are also a businessman and head of several firms specializing in coaching and investment promotion. How do you manage to reconcile this with your duties as an elected member, mayor, and chairman of the National Association of Communes and United Towns of Cameroon?
Well, I like to say that it's an advantage to be a company director because the private sector calls for a lot more thought, and this ability to think, to structure, and to organize has enabled me to better manage my commune and the organization of the umbrella organizations of communes in Cameroon, which I was elected because it must be said that my team and myself were brought here by an election. So it enables us to have the tools that we bring from the private sector to the public sector. But this is not a unique case in Cameroon. When you go to the west of Cameroon, I think 70 to 80% of mayors are company directors, and I think it's even lucky sometimes to have wealthy mayors or mayors who have other capacities for action and intervention who even support local development.
What are you doing to attract investment on the African continent and more specifically in Cameroon?
We have a very pronounced territorial marketing approach. We organize the GECOM, the concept of GECOM being the International Economic Days of Communes in Cameroon, and we are now at the second edition. Support agreements were signed for agricultural projects and local authorities. That's what we think. We think that there is an economic co-production that is geared towards the search for professionalism by seeking out foreign partners. That's why this platform, the International Economic Days for Local Authorities, is being used to put financiers, investors, local authorities, economic projects, and private sector projects led by local authorities on the same stage, in order to nurture the hope that changes in our country will take place.
Well, that's it. Initiative Africa is over for today. You can find the interview with Augustin Tamba as well as our programs on our website, africaonair.com. And of course, don't forget to follow us on our social networks and to share, like, and comment with the hashtag Initiative Africa. And don't forget to tune in next week on the same channel at the same time with Business Africa. Let me seize this opportunity to wish you all a Happy New Year and see you next week. Goodbye.